Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a close look at Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré. Specifically, the really rapid, quite dramatic changes happening there, especially its relationship with Russia. Our mission really is to explore the core transformations this source is describing. We're talking visible military shifts, but also what the source suggests are more hidden security dynamics, new surveillance tech, and the strategy behind their economic moves.
So get ready, because we're going to explore how, according to this source material, one country is pretty dramatically reshaping its identity and its alliances. It's challenging a lot of the old norms and doing it fast. It's a fascinating view.
Okay, let's dig in then. What really jumps out first from this material are the very visible changes in Burkina Faso's military camps, especially right after President Traoré's meeting in Moscow. It sounds like things looked quite different almost immediately.
That's right. The source goes into detail. Uniforms changing. The actual sound of the drills is different. Apparently, you hear foreign accents, Russian accents, presumably. On the training grounds, it suggests this isn't just, an upgrade.
Not just new boots.
No, more like a fundamental rebuild of the military structure.
And it's not just the atmosphere. This material highlights quiet convoys arriving under tight security since Traoré got back from Russia. And it makes a point that they aren't bringing in, food or medical supplies.
Instead, the source is specific. Crates labeled in Cyrillic. It talks about Russian body armor, infrared optics, encrypted communication systems, close combat weapons, all replacing the older, often secondhand Western gear they had.
So the framing here, based on the source, isn't just swapping kit. It's building a whole new army from the ground up, basically modeled on Russia's approach.
Pretty much, yeah. And the scale of the training involved is notable, too. The source claims that unlike previous, say, NATO-linked missions, which apparently capped the number of training slots, maybe to avoid overdependence, who knows?
Right.
Russia has, quote, opened the floodgates. It even states that entire Burkina battalions are reportedly scheduled for combat training rotations in Russia itself.
Okay, and this is where the source gets really specific, doesn't it? About the kind of tactics being taught. It mentions hybrid warfare, cyber resilience, urban counterinsurgency.
And it explicitly links the model being used to Russia's playbook from places like Syria, Chechnya, and the Donbass region.
And the source adds a pretty pointed comment there that these soldiers are being trained for dominance, not necessarily restraint.
Yeah, that's a direct assertion from the material.
And this training isn't just happening abroad. The source notes new military academies opening up inside Burkina Faso. And the instructors are described as, a mix of official Russians and maybe contractors, standardizing Russian doctrine right there.
And part of that doctrinal shift, according to the source, involves rejigging the command structure, moving away from the more decentralized Western-style units towards these hierarchical, Russia-modeled brigades that prioritize shock, speed, and loyalty.
So the bigger picture painted here is an army being reshaped, not just to fight the ongoing insurgency, right? It sounds like it's about building a force to repel foreign threats, resist internal coups, and, enforce a political vision, a state army protecting the state's project.
Exactly. The source even claims this new approach is already showing results in border skirmishes, citing reports of drone-guided raids and jammer-equipped ambushes by Burkina forces, tactics it describes as pretty uncharacteristic of the old army, but straight out of that Russian asymmetric warfare doctrine.
And beyond the battlefield stuff, this material points to the symbolism. State TV featuring Russian Tiger armored vehicles, playing Russian marching songs, speeches talking about our allies in the East.
So yeah, pulling it all together, what this source is strongly suggesting is that the army itself has become a kind of political institution, signaling very clearly, visually, and operationally this fundamental shift in the country's alliances.
But okay, while that military transformation is happening out in the open, the source then pivots, doesn't it, to something less visible, maybe more elusive, happening, quote, behind the scenes.
Right. This is the stuff that isn't getting press releases. The source material says it quite bluntly. Despite official denials from Moscow, Wagner is back, referring to the paramilitary group, obviously.
And it claims there are familiar footprints, things like security convoys operating without flight plans, armored vehicles without any national markings, and these descriptions of, quote, pale-skinned trainers who speak no French but move with authority in restricted areas.
The source puts forward the idea that after Prigozhin's death, Wagner didn't just vanish. It sort of evolved, became a quieter, maybe more streamlined network, now operating under the official cover of military technical cooperation.
And the source draws a distinction here compared to Wagner's role in, say, Mali or the Calar. There, it suggests the main job was fighting. But in Burkina Faso, it's described differently, more like strategically reshaping the state's nervous system.
Yeah, influencing security, intelligence, border control, crucially, resource protection, and maybe even political enforcement.
The source zooms in on two key roles for this: presence. First, securing valuable resources, specifically gold and phosphate mines. Wagner-linked units are reportedly guarding these extraction zones and the transport routes.
And the interpretation offered by the source isn't that this is just security assistance. It's seen as a calculated trade. Russia, in return, supposedly gets favorable access to mining concessions, possibly sidestepping the IMF transparency rules that might have applied before.
Makes sense. What's the second role?
The second one mentioned is political shielding. The source points to quiet reports from human rights observers, NGOs,
Right.
about dissident groups, activist leaders kind of vanishing in recent weeks, often in regions where Wagner is said to be active, and notably without official charges or much media attention.
So the source reads that pattern as a message.
Yeah, it describes it as a subtle but chilling message, signaling a new order that, well, doesn't tolerate disruption.
And maybe the most critical role, according to this source, is psychological. Just their presence changes things.
That's the argument, that their presence alone reshapes the risk calculation for any foreign power thinking about intervening.
The source even cites supposedly leaked diplomatic cables, suggesting France actually paused surveillance flights near northern Burkina Faso out of fear of, quote, unpredictable responses.
Right. And this source interprets that diplomatic speak as basically meaning, don't mess with Wagner. It frames this Western hesitation not as some kind of mistake, but as a strategic retreat, a sign that maybe the West doesn't call all the shots there anymore, for now at least.
And this material also suggests Wagner's influence goes beyond just security personnel, into things like communications advice, political risk analysis, maybe even helping develop cyber strategy, laying groundwork for digital autonomy aligned with Moscow.
So yeah, if the regular army is the visible muscle being rebuilt, Wagner in this source's view is like an invisible hand, guiding, shielding, imposing a certain discipline. But the changes aren't just on the ground or behind the scenes.
Right, because the source then looks up, doesn't it, to the upper atmosphere, suggesting Burkina Faso is building what it calls a sky fortress.
Exactly. What's highlighted is this satellite agreement quietly signed with Moscow, apparently coordinated through this new alliance of Sahel states, the AES. And the source presents this as a huge step, putting Burkina Faso into the orbit of global intelligence collection for the first time, really.
And it contrasts that really starkly with the past, where the source says Burkina Faso basically had to, quote, beg France or ask third parties for even low-res, delayed satellite pictures of its own country.
That era, according to this analysis, is over. With Russian help, Burkina Faso now reportedly has near real-time access to high-resolution satellite feeds, covering its own territory and the wider Sahel.
And it's not just about looking down, is it? The source describes these new satellite systems part of a bigger Russian push in Africa. It notes as having capabilities like thermal tracking, signal interception, even encrypted communications relays.
Which allows the state to do things it couldn't before, according to the source. Like tracking insurgent movements at night, intercepting communications across borders, coordinating responses in multiple locations almost instantly. That's a whole different level of capability.
The source also throws in tools like geofencing, like setting up digital boundaries around sensitive spots, gold mines, military bases, border zones that trigger alerts if there's unauthorized movement. It calls it territorial awareness on a digital scale.
And a key detail, the source flags. The data from these systems apparently flows through a command structure using Russian telemetry systems, bypassing the older French platforms entirely.
This material also mentions potential civilian uses too, extending this infrastructure to things like emergency comms, national broadcasting, maybe even building satellite internet backbones independent of Western tech companies, to secure data flows, reduce foreign cyber vulnerability.
Yeah, the source really leans into this idea that modern conflict, modern power, isn't just about force, it's about information. Who sees first? Who reacts fastest? Who owns that information loop? And in that area, Burkina Faso is presented as having taken a giant leap forward, becoming a player in surveillance, not just a customer asking for favors.
And that obviously has ripple effects regionally. The source notes neighboring governments, especially those still aligned with the West, are reportedly, well, terrified is the word used, unsure about what Burkina Faso can suddenly see from orbit.
The source suggests opacity breeds caution. And in this new Sahel dynamic, Burkina Faso isn't just being watched anymore, it's become the watcher.
And this control of the skies, the source argues, feeds right back into Traore's overall vision. It gives him, quote, predictive power to anticipate trouble, monitor dissent, protect state assets.
And crucially, the source presents all this as being backed by Russia, characterized here as a partner with no interest in regime change, no colonial guilt to exploit, and no humanitarian clauses tucked away in the agreements. This support is seen as key to building this vision of sovereignty that extends to, as the source puts it, every pixel, signal, and frequency.
But sovereignty needs to be grounded, right? Security and surveillance are one thing, but you need an engine, an economic engine. And this analysis argues that's the next layer of transformation, economic independence.
Exactly. The source talks about changes happening in the fields, factories, mines, the economic engine that needs to power all this.
It paints this picture of Burkina Faso's rural economy being structurally trapped for decades, exporting cash crops like cotton, but importing basic food, essentially, quote, starving on foreign terms. And that equation, the source claims, is being flipped post-Moscow.
Yeah, it describes Russia sending things like high-yield seeds, fertilizer components, irrigation tech, part of a joint program focused on boosting local food production.
Characterized as strategic agroengineering, Russian agronomists supposedly working with Burkinabe technicians to build sustainable, self-sufficient food systems. It even mentions pilot projects near rivers like the Muhun and Kamoa.
And the goal stated in the source is pretty ambitious: for Burkina Faso to become a net exporter of rice and tomatoes by 2026.
Wow. And it's not just growing food, but processing it too. The source mentions technical support for agro-industry packaging, canning, helping export across the Sahel, with state-backed cooperatives forming.
Then you get to gold, which the source calls Burkina Faso's most coveted resource. Often, it notes, extracted by foreign firms with little wealth staying in the country. Russia's reported proposal, according to the source: refine it locally, tax it locally, store it locally.
And there's talk of a new refinery project, backed by Russian engineers and Burkinabe state funds, to stop smuggling and make sure the wealth actually benefits the country.
The source calls that potentially profound. If Burkina Faso starts exporting refined gold bullion instead of raw ore, it could cut a major chain of dependency that, in this view, has kept it resource-rich but cash-poor.
Trade patterns are also shifting, according to this. New transport deals, new trade corridors being negotiated quietly, Russian companies supposedly investing in logistics, rail, telecoms.
And the source frames this as deliberately building alternatives to the existing, often French-owned infrastructure. Infrastructure, it suggests, was sometimes used as soft power levers in the past.
Even education gets pulled into this economic strategy. Scholarships, vocational training, and Russian technical schools for Burkinabe engineers, coders, agronomists.
The source calls it brain reloading, contrasting it directly with what it describes as Western aid models that sometimes resulted in brain drain.
And the nature of the deals themselves. The source characterizes Russia's approach here as mutual benefit contracts. It spells it out like, you produce, we buy, you host, we build, you win, we stay. Explicitly contrasting this with Western aid, described here as often involving quick loans and impossible conditions.
So what this source is outlining is really a blueprint for economic sovereignty, aiming for a future where the country doesn't have to rely on exporting its people or depending on donors or, quote, begging for forgiveness every budget cycle.
Okay, but making all these huge changes, military, security, satellites, economy that breaks a lot of old rules, can it last without political cover? The source asks, who's watching Traore's back as he does all this?
Yeah, this source definitely argues something really big is happening here, that the pieces on the board have moved, and that France and its Western allies are basically watching a checkmate form in slow motion.
It gives that historical context, right? Describing Burkina Faso as having been this well-worn cog in France's post-colonial sphere, dependent economically, tied militarily, always operating under Paris's shadow, politically speaking.
And that whole long-standing model, this source argues, just shattered because of, as it puts it, one parade, one alliance, and one president willing to rip up the script.
And the source finds the Western reactions since that Traore-Putin meeting very telling, describing it as mostly silence or this strange, hesitant diplomacy, a kind of shrug, a stutter, a fear of escalation, which it interprets as showing that deep down, maybe Western powers feel they've lost the room.
And it's bigger than just Burkina Faso, the source suggests. It points to a potential regional realignment. Countries like Mali, Niger, even Chad are seen as increasingly echoing Traore's stance, rejecting foreign bases, pushing back against IMF conditions, turning towards these eastward partnerships.
So what might have looked like separate coups before, this source starts framing as potentially coordinated realignments.
That's the suggestion. And the source asks, well, what leverage does the West really have anymore? When military bases get kicked out, mining permits get pulled, ambassador statements seem to fall flat, intelligence sharing stops, and that old AFRICOM playbook just doesn't seem to apply.
Western responses are depicted by this source as pretty weak, right? Issuing bland statements saying they're monitoring the situation, while behind the scenes there's a quiet scramble by diplomats and intel agencies.
And financial institutions, the source claims, are starting to get nervous about the potential for new monetary unions, maybe anti-dollar trade deals emerging under this AES banner, with Russian backing making it seem more plausible.
And those traditional Western weapons sanctions, conditional loans, visa bans, the source suggests they just don't bite like they used to. Because Traore is apparently getting support from Moscow, Minsk, maybe even Beijing is watching.
But here's the kicker, according to this source. What supposedly scares the West the most isn't just the new tanks or the political chess moves. It's the popular support. The legitimacy Traore seems to be building on the street.
That raw, youth-led energy cheering for sovereignty. The crowds mocking foreign intervention, chanting AES slogans. The source is emphatic. That is what Western powers can't contain. It's not just about power shifting between elites, it's about the narrative itself collapsing.
And there's a huge cultural symbolism highlighted by the source, too. When an African leader, as this material portrays it, can fly over airspace previously controlled by others, stand next to Vladimir Putin, and be treated seemingly as a peer, not a client, that rewrites decades of diplomatic theater.
It sends a message, doesn't it, to the younger generation across the region, perhaps, that you don't necessarily need approval from Paris or Washington to be a player on the world stage. You can build your own table.
Yeah. So this source concludes by painting this picture. Burkina Faso is busy arming itself, feeding itself, watching its skies, while the West is kind of stuck, wondering how it lost control so quickly and maybe when the next domino falls.
The source ends pretty starkly, stating that, in its view, the illusion of the empire already has fallen.
So quite a journey through the source material today. Yeah. We've touched on the military overhaul, that complex, shadowy role described for paramilitary forces, the new eye in the sky with satellite tech, the big push for economic independence, and how this source sees the political fallout and Western reaction.
Absolutely. And just to reiterate, this deep dive pulled directly from that specific source you provided, giving us its particular detailed perspective on these really dramatic changes happening in Burkina Faso and how its place in the world seems to be shifting so rapidly.
Right. And maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on after hearing all this. Considering the sheer scale and speed of the transformations described in this source material and all the potential impacts it outlines, from national sovereignty and security to regional power balances, what do you think might be the most significant, maybe even unforeseen, long-term consequence of this kind of radical realignment, both for Burkina Faso and for the wider region? Something to think about.